I can't say how long I have been waiting for this conversation. Truly, I just need to say that again. It's been a long haul, a long time waiting to talk with men about men and to hear what you have to say. So I am here today really as truthfully as a listener, as somebody who wants to learn from you about what we need to know more about, right? As much as I want to share what I've learned about disasters, and particularly about gender, and most particularly about women and girls. But first, let me backtrack a little bit and say thank you. I think we lost Jim, but that was a fabulous welcome to country, and I only wish we did that in the United States. We do not, and it's our shame that we don't. It's our loss. So he's grounded our conversation in a place. And you bring with you particular experiences that will help you engage in conversation with us. I'm tasking myself really with trying to broaden our discussion a bit, because a lot of my work has been in the United States, quite a bit has been international as well. Let me tell you just a little bit about that. I'm an accidental disaster sociologist. I had a quite normal life before we moved to Miami in 1992. 2 months before Hurricane Andrew came, my loving husband, a geologist, was in Kalgoorlie looking for gold. He was like gone, absent, missing in action when the hurricane came. So we went through this with myself and my 2 small boys. So while most of my research has been about women in disaster, my family, it was all about my boys, my sons, my father, my husband. So it's been near and dear to my heart, but I have not been able to move into men and masculinities and disasters as a researcher yet. So again, this is really a path-breaking conference. It's an opportunity to learn from one another, figure out what we need to do next. Thank yous. Thank you again for whoever it is who footed that bill for that enormously expensive trip over here. It really costs a lot of money, and I do appreciate it. Thank you for the organizers for being there and for the work that you did as researchers, which again is just, I keep saying this to you, but path-breaking. I've been telling everybody in the United States that I'm coming to have this conversation with you about masculinities. It's so long overdue. Thank you for all of you who left everything that you should be doing today behind, all that work, all the dishes perhaps, the family issues, the community work that you need to be doing, everything you left behind to be here today. And I know it's a big ask. Many of you drove a long way as well. And thank you for coming with open hearts and being able to be in touch again with what you've seen and what you've been through, to share that to the degree that you would like to. That's also something very precious that you bring. I'll be talking a lot from photographs, so I'd like to also just put out there that I am kind of breaking the law here. I don't attribute particular photographs to their photographers. I apologize for that to them in absentia. Come visit me in jail if somebody ever calls me on this. But I use photographs to tell a story about disaster. But I do thank the photographers, and I particularly thank the subjects who let me speak about them through their images, and of course without their permission. So just know that when I'm using my clicker, which is surely here someplace, thank you, that they didn't invite me to use their images, but I'm cheerfully doing so as well. So with that, let me say, first of all, I have been told more than once I speak a little bit too quickly, so if I do, please, Tricia, I'm looking at you, let me know, please. We have about an hour, and this is what I'd like to talk with you about, basically, these general themes. We can stop and talk a little bit more, perhaps at the end of the day, have some conversation about some of these in particular. But the title of the talk is The Gendered Terrain of Disaster Through Men's Eyes, which comes from the first collection of work that we did with my colleagues Betty Herm Morrow in the United States, bringing together an international collection of writing about disasters through women's eyes. Knowing at the time that we were telling a partial story, but not having the capacity, not having the knowledge or the research yet to tell a fuller story. So why do we need a gender lens? We won't have much time to talk about that, but I thought I would just make a few essential points about that. And the most essential one is that gender is always part of our lives. It's part of who we are. It's part of the symbolic kind of artistic world that we move in, the ideological world. It structures our organizations and institutions. It helps us understand who is where in a particular moment, when the winds come, when the fire comes, who's doing what and how and where, how we feel about it, how our bodies might respond differently, the different kind of cultural norms and understandings we have. So it's really important to say at the outset that while gender may not always be the most important thing that we need to understand when we talk about risk communication or emergency management relief systems or long-term recovery or mitigation, preparedness, it's never, ever irrelevant. because it's always part of us and who we are. It's good to see you again. Yeah. So I think that there are enormous gaps. Again, as a sociologist, I've done a number of studies, and now I'm trying to move forward and working as a professor with the next generation of emergency management students. And this is what I try and impress upon them, that gender is not an add-on, something that overburdened people who are already doing too much during the day need to suddenly take on board and become gender experts. No. It's that if we're talking about resilience, we have to understand that from a gender perspective. What does it mean for men's relationships with other men and women's relationships with other women and men and women, right? If we're looking at long-term recovery, what are some of the sort of gender issues and themes that were so clearly laid out? And Graham, thank you again for that, for laying out the landscape for us and sketching out the major themes. So if even we're looking at good practice, what does that mean? What is it that makes a practice good and healthy and helpful and sustainable? Well, there are some gender concerns there as well. Bottom line, I would challenge us to think of anything in this work of anticipating and preparing and coping, surviving, and responding and recovering from disaster that does not come back to sex and sexualities and gender relationships. So, it's kind of an article of faith. I would just leave that there. But having said that, it's also important to understand that there's not one single gender lens. And if only we study hard enough or get that PhD, we capture it. Of course not. Gender is just like any other kind of social power dynamic that shifts. The moment you shift your angle of vision just a tad to, say, 50 years ago in this part of the country, right? Or to 2,000 years from now, or to another era, to another culture, to another generation. As soon as we shift just a bit, we see sometimes a radically different picture of what gender means in crises, in situations. So it's important for us to understand that, again, it's not something that one gets and checks off the list, but there's a sensitivity and awareness to the depth and complexities of gender when we're talking about women and men and boys and girls. So there's no one single lens, and then I do love the metaphor of the kaleidoscope, because I think we need to be always turning that lens, if you will, to see what's new, and there will always be something new. Well, let me make a few preliminary points about men, and bear with me, I'm a sociologist, we generalize, we do this for a living. So when you think to yourself, well, that's not true for me, then hold that thought and let's talk about it some more, but we are speaking in generalities here as social scientists, or I am. Well, who speaks for men? I'm sad to say that really nobody speaks for men, and again, that's why I'm so excited to be here, right? We know the popular culture. I mean, somebody made that film, The Titanic, and it has all kinds of messages that men are presumably taking on board and articulating in their own lives. The notion that even the middle-class professional kind of model of hegemonic masculinity in our particular era is also a hero. He has that cape on. That's an articulation of a particular ideal, not necessarily generated by actual men in the universe. And of course, our humor and that notion that men should always be self-sacrificial, that women and children, by definition, come before the value of any male life. Who's articulating that idea? Yeah, and where did that come from? The bottom picture is an Australian picture, and it's the one that comes home to me as a researcher most, because virtually all that I've learned about men and masculinities and disasters, aside from what happened in my family, I learned from women. So we have a very partial sight. We have a derivative sense of what men's lives are like in disaster, because other people are speaking on your behalf. They're telling us about how you felt, or what they tried to help you with, or what they thought you were going through, or what they think that you're needing. So she here may be speaking for him because he is silenced, or because he's silencing himself, can't get it out, right? Could be. Or she may be speaking for him because the researcher is letting the person who speaks most freely and is more accustomed to that kind of dialogue that you have with somebody with a tape recorder. In any event, he is silenced in that sense, and that's a shame. So we have to understand some of the reasons for that. It's partially, and again, that's why I'm so appreciative of your presence here today, that men are silencing themselves, I think not wanting to, not caring to, not considering that there's something of value in the dialogue around gender. That's been the case in the kind of the history of feminist studies until relatively recently, that men and masculinity studies have come to the fore, so we're beginning to move beyond that. But that certainly has been true in the past. From a practitioner perspective, there's the notion that gender kind of falls off the radar screen, and men in particular, because people in our culture, in our time, stand in for men. The generic male is the same thing as the generic victim, if you will, or the survivor, the responder, is kind of implicitly always men. So you talk sometimes with people and they say, well, I'm always talking about men. But they're not. They're not articulating that notion of masculinity. They're just confounding people with men. Another reason that follows from that is basically when we do talk about gender, we so often assume that that means women, and you know that very well, so I won't belabor that point. It doesn't mean women, of course, but that's how it's interpreted. And when we talk about women, sometimes what we really mean is families or children. There's a lot to be said about that confounding, again, of women and children. There's also a notion, I think, at the scholarly level of benign neglect, and I would say it's not particularly benign, but it's certainly neglectful, and it comes both from disaster researchers and from gender scholars, and it comes from our institutionalized response system, disaster management. And that is a cultural universal. I put it out there. Would love to be proven wrong, but this is the lay of the land so far. It's a highly masculinized culture, and statistically and culturally and sociologically, politically. And I think there's also something to be said about why we have such silence around men and masculinities and disasters that comes to power and resistance, to not wanting to know, not wanting to ask, not wanting to say, not wanting to show. And I hope maybe this afternoon we could come back to that a little bit, talk a little bit more about that. Well, I've identified a number of challenges that I'd like to put forward today, and before I launch into those, they're kind of Elaine's idea of 12 or 10 kind of streams of knowledge and, if you will, a kind of an action research agenda. In other words, questions that we need to know more about. But I'm conscious as I do that, and I was putting together this talk, of one of the best critiques of the gender and disaster subfield that I read. And this person was critical of our work and was making the point that we are at risk of replacing one stereotype with another. So I often write, particularly maybe 5 or 10 years ago, more than now, of weeping women rescued by strong-armed men in disaster, right? Because it's such a positive, such a strong norm. You see it in popular culture all the time. I see it in movies. It's just everywhere. She's crying all the time. He's rescuing her, right? He's strong. She's weak. So in our work, there has been an emphasis, perhaps understandable, but I think not good. There's been an emphasis on reversing that. So let's study the capacities of women, the resilience of women, the leadership of women, the cultural knowledge that women and girls bring. But the same token, the flip side of that, is that we have been looking more at the weaknesses, if you will, the vulnerabilities of men in a way to kind of balance these stereotypes, and I think it's a loss. I think that's something that we should not do. Basically, what we have to do is understand the complexities of women and men and boys and girls and everybody in between, all of us who share both vulnerabilities and strengths pretty much all the time, and particularly acutely during crises. So getting away from this readjusting one stereotype by replacing another one, the strengths of women and the weaknesses of men. I make that point because a lot of the research and my themes that I'll be drawing out today focus on vulnerabilities, the challenges, the things that really make it difficult. And that's not only because I care about that, but because that's what we know most about so far. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. So before we launch into that, it's imperative to kind of sketch a little bit of the sense of the lay of land around masculinity and power, because that's the flip side of this. There's a larger context to a discussion about the vulnerabilities of men, and that is the power that accrues to men. Again, this is a long and familiar argument to you, that men bring to the situation by virtue of growing up boys in our culture. So it's not something necessarily that men seek or that men willingly pursue, and some do, of course, and some don't, but it benefits all men differently in different ways in different circumstances. So it's the lay of the land. We have to start there. And this picture comes from Bangladesh, makes the point very vividly to me, because these are twin children, and you can see which one is the girl and which one is the boy. And we understand just from this graphic image who's more likely to survive in a disaster and who's not. And we don't need the World Health Association to tell us about the lower caloric intake of girls around the world to see what this picture means. So there's that literal cultural survival. There's the global economy that has been constructed largely by male-driven international financial organizations and a massive kind of international, not massive, it's an international global economic system that benefits and privileges elites who are predominantly men, right? In this picture, men in Mexico. We used to always say white men. Well, it's not true, but male elites, and puts women on the streets at their feet. Again, this is a system. It's not a question of blaming or whatever. It's a question of what are we doing about it? What are we going to do about it? But there is that sense of privilege that accrues to men. Men also have, as you know, a much stronger leadership role, if not domination, in most of the scientific and technical fields, which come strongly into play in disaster risk management, as they do in the acclamation that accrues to men and women, but to a greater degree here, men, who are in response and rescue roles. So if you look at who wears the uniform, who the photographer is going to focus on. In this case, these are two men who are receiving, I'm sure, a well-deserved reward for rescuing some people from a burning building. And I just put it to us that there are women who also rescue in different ways and do life-saving activities every day and will never be behind the photographer's screen and will not be framed in that way. So that's the power, again, that's a privilege that accrues to men. And then there's an ideological power. There's a misogyny that's free-floating, right? I mean, these are just little pictures from Katrina. I won't belabor that one in there, but there's a sense of entitlement that men can and do articulate that free-floating, really hatred and misogyny, I think, of women that surfaces at moments of crisis as a joke, as a humor. There's a lot to be said about gender and disaster and humor. And speaking of humor, I mean, I really don't get this, but people are selling this. Maybe you have ordered yours already, underwear for your small children or for your grandchildren who would like to grow up and become real men, i.e. become an emergency manager. But the one on the left is, of course, in pink with incipient breasts. So I don't get it, but there's some kind of a mixed message there. And this picture just, again, stands in for the generally received male power to be the voice of disaster, to bring the news to us. So that framing that men traditionally have done through the media is another way that men have power in disasters, do run the operational, day-to-day operations of disasters around the world, do make the political decisions. This is Governor Christie in New Jersey and the widely noted handshake between him and our current President Obama, right? Making critical decisions about whether there will be federal monies coming into the state, whether the governor will even accept them. So those are decisions made at the higher echelons of our political system, which pretty much around the world are dominated by men in a particular class and racial composition. There's also, I put this picture here to remind us that there's a physicality as well to power, to gender power, and here is just one among many pictures that you can find where when push comes to shove, and it does in disasters, and somebody gets the food and somebody doesn't, physical prowess and power comes into play, as it does here. This is just a very hard picture to see, but basically there is a demonstration against what women were articulating was the sexual violence against women in Katrina, right? And so I put a little flyer down here at the end to show you that women were also organizing around that. But those are some of the things that come up that are as kind of the larger frame that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the vulnerabilities of men and boys, the challenges that they face. My last slide also, man-made disasters. We avoided this language for quite a long time, and I think I'd like to reclaim it in a way because there's a certain sense in which disasters are made by men. When we look at disaster risk reduction and ask ourselves what has to change and who has made the most critical changes, critical decisions about where we develop, where our population resides, what kind of money and resources will be put into different systems, how strong our houses are, whether our schools have safe rooms, whether we devote the resources necessary to meet the challenges of a changing dynamic climate or not, these decisions, by and large, are made by the political and economic elites of every country, and those people are generally men. So it's a provocative statement, but I say I'd like to reclaim that notion that these are men-made disasters, and again, challenge us all to work together to end that. I hope I've already sparked some things that you disagree about. We can come back to that at the end of the day, but let me move on a little bit to articulate 10 challenges. And the first is a problem for me. It's one of the main things that comes up in disaster sociology is how many people lost their lives, and were they women or were they men? And to me, this is at once one of the most important questions, because until we know who's most at risk of the loss of life, we don't know who it is we have to reach or how to reach them. At the same time, there's an implicit kind of an invidious distinction. It's mainly women, therefore, it's mainly men, therefore. When in fact, of course, we would all agree in this room that every human life is precious, so at least we can agree on that and maybe spend a little bit less time documenting whether they are male or female deaths. But there's a very practical point to that, as I've just said. We have to understand it. Culturally, however, the norm, the understanding is that women and children die in much higher proportion in natural disasters, and I'm going to talk mainly about environmentally inspired disasters today, than men. And that's actually not true. It's an empirical observation from some countries, and one of the major studies that made this point in a very strong way was from a study, an international study that compared countries that were very rich and countries that were very poor, and then overlaid on that an analysis of gender relations. So in poor countries that had very strikingly unequal power relationships between women and men, very high levels of female fatality. That study has been picked up by the media and is kind of taken as gospel that women will always die in larger numbers than men, and it's not true. Again, we need to look at under what conditions people lose their lives and try and understand that. But the gender component is important because we need to figure out how it is to reach the people who are most at risk. So I don't need to tell you, you will have different images of your own in your mind when I show you this picture of the hotshot fire team that lost their lives in Arizona not long ago. And there was something about the fact that these young men who devoted their entire life to being a hotshot firefighter, right, were working to defend their own community. They're trying to piece together what happened. Why did everybody, one survivor in this whole trail, why did everybody die that day? And one of the factors that's been brought forward is, again, because it was hometown. It was turf. It was their home turf, and that led them perhaps to linger longer than they could have or might have otherwise, and then the winds shifted, and you know the story. Men do die statistically more often in floods than women, so we might ask if insurance companies have known for some time about the risk-taking behaviors of men, right, in little red cars like my two boys, who would cheerfully go through a river unless it's like up to the hood, because why not? Like my car can make it. And there's a tragic end to those funny stories. We need to really take that on board in terms of fatalities. Men often, as do women, but men in particular, will stay home to defend assets. Women lose their lives more often when they're staying home to defend the children, to try and retain what they can of the household and to try and get those children to safety. But men are more likely, this is just internationally as a generalization again, to stay home and not evacuate as quickly or to put their own lives on the line in order to defend the livelihood, assets, and resources that are essential for that family. But men also, as women do absolutely sacrifice themselves, as you well know, to rescue and do whatever they can to help the children and the people around them who are most vulnerable. And that's another reason why men who predominate in formal response roles as well as informal response roles lose their lives so tragically. But there are other reasons that have to do with the general construction of gender. So why is it that we have such high rates of homelessness among men, higher among men than among women, although there's some differences in terms of how that plays out. But if you look at who's on the streets in, for example, Boulder, Colorado, where we had a 1,000-year flood, it's my hometown, just flew through in there, and one of the concerns is that we'll never know how many people lost their lives because all of the homeless people who were never counted anyway and who would not necessarily have been able to get out of harm's way, and those are predominantly men, so we will never know. So homelessness is a major vulnerability in disasters. It's a male-dominated social category. As is extreme heat, a very interesting case in point here. There's a fabulous book you may have seen called Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of the Chicago Heat Wave by Eric Kleinenberg. And he went into Chicago in 1995 and tried to understand, there's a very large number of people whose bodies were never claimed by anybody who died in this horrific heat wave. Predominantly African American, poor, old, and male. Tried to understand why that happened in that community, right? And it's a striking contrast to the research that you may remember on the conclusions after the European heat wave, which were dominated by fatalities among women. So what is it? And the answer is basically we don't know, and we had better find out. It's a really critical research question to understand under what conditions will more men likely to die in heat waves than women. In the United States, more men die in heat waves. I haven't done the research here. Maybe you can tell me at break whether it's similar or different here. But given what we know about the climate in the future, heat waves are more and more pressing issues. So again, trying to understand how to reach people with messages that are meaningful and can be acted upon is imperative. One of the things that he found is that men were fearful of gender violence at the hands of younger men in their community. So they closed their windows and didn't let even whatever breezes there might have been there come in. That was one factor. He also writes about the gender of isolation, because old and poor men do not remarry, are so estranged from their families and their kin. There was nobody there to know them the day before the heat wave, and there was nobody there to claim their bodies the day after the heat wave. They did not ask for help. They knew nobody to ask for help, and perhaps as a matter of pride they wouldn't have. That's another, it's just a question. So that's another factor, as is suicide. And again, I know you have your own images here as well. I just devote this slide to the first documented suicide in my country after the BP oil spill. And he was a person who made his living in fishing, and surprise, surprise, when that oil took his livelihood away, he took his life. It's something we see way too often. So there's survival, I think, another challenge that follows from this. And these 10 ideas are very closely woven. I was thinking this morning, it's kind of like the lattice on the apple pie, right? You have to understand the intricacies, and you can't tease them apart, because then you lose the beautiful lattice of the pie. But they're all closely interwoven. So death, of course, has a lot to do with safety. You see that men are at risk in a lot of the informal rescue activities that men do. They're at risk because of the damage and cleanup and repair work as well. There's nothing safe about being out there with rudimentary tools and sharp metal edges, and somebody has to do it, and most of the time the people who are doing it are survivors. They are on the scene doing what needs to be done so that they can get their lives headed back in the right direction again. Not a lot of care and attention goes into safety. Similarly here, this is again another picture and another cause. It happened after Hurricane Mitch in Nicaragua, for example, of high male fatalities because of men who are not accustomed to using heavy machinery, who don't know what they're doing, and yet, you know, for the best of intentions, get out there and pick up the chainsaw. Which always reminds me of the story in Miami when we had lost our house, and my husband's colleagues came down with their chainsaws in hands, and with not one but two, probably 10 cases of beer. I thought it was just really fun. They were sitting out back with the beer and the chainsaws, and I was a nervous wreck. Of course, we didn't have any house, we didn't have any food, we didn't have any place to stay. That was part of it, but that was what they were doing, their way of helping, and I was worried about their safety. It is a concern, it is a factor. As is, again, the kind of pickup, the recovery, the physical recovery work that goes on in the community. These men are not provided the kind of help that we might wish for them, hard hats, training, heavy equipment. No, people get out and do what they have to do. Again, very often men. And when they do have uniforms and hard hats and some training, there's another kind of harm that comes from safety, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that as well. How many men have that hug, that response, that male-on-male, shoulder, body-on-body kind of support when they're doing really rugged work and wondering who's underneath that pancaked concrete? Who's there for them to touch them? This is a picture from Sri Lanka of transgendered community. I was going to get that right. It's not Aravasi. Aravani. People there whose role is just now beginning to be explored, but the sexual minorities in general, and particularly highly stigmatized and marginalized communities, such as a transgendering community, right, are at extreme risk in disasters. So this is a picture you would consider in a show about men as well as about women. But it's interesting, so we're doing a little bit more research around what they were able to bring to, in a positive way, bring to recovery after the cyclone there, because of their relatively progressive politics. But that's, again, an empirical question. But men who do not conform, sexually in this case, are obviously at risk of danger. Men who, and these are boys basically, who take up risk-taking activities. How many times have you seen on your newspaper, the storm is coming and here's the weather person, the weatherman, right, with his camera showing you how close he is to the water, how close he can get to death so we can watch it on the screen. It's madness, but it's what little boys do when they run out and go surfing when the surf's up, right? And they don't always make it back. And this picture speaks to me about trafficking, because again, in our conversations about trafficking after disaster, it almost always goes immediately to sex trafficking of girls. Sometimes there's sex trafficking of boys is on our radar screen, and I don't diminish for a moment the reality of that. But it's also true that the trafficking of children is about the sex trafficking of boys and about slave labor, child labor, right? Cheap labor. So universally, that's another one of the risks and harms that boys face more than girls, being taken from their communities, being ripped off, their labor being exploited, forced to leave to be cheap labor. This is a picture from Haiti, and who knows what the fate of the children were there. So health, again, these are also closely interwoven, but men, because of a lot of the response roles that they have, are exposed in a way that women in these roles, or that women, because they're not in these roles, are not, to toxics, for example, in complex emergencies, and I won't linger on this picture from the tsunami because I think you have pictures of horror in your own mind, but that seeing what you have had to see takes a huge toll. And sometimes, picture from Australia, the grief is too much to be borne. Too much for children as well. And we don't, again, in our analysis of gender, we have spent so little time talking about children. And when we do, we talk about children as a degendered group. Children, animals, pets. All of them actually have a sex and a sexuality, but I'm concerned that we're beginning to look a little bit more closely at children in disaster, but without looking at some of those differences and similarities, but the differences between what boys and girls bring to a situation when they're 6, which is different than when they're 16, right? We know the difference between our 6-year-old sons and our 16-year-olds. So there's a health issue for him as well. And then, of course, the familiar picture of men who are unable, and you just don't have to be a researcher for very long to hear this, again, from women, unable to bring themselves to ask for help. Not necessarily not knowing where the help is there, not necessarily not knowing that they don't need it, knowing that they need it, knowing that it's available, not able to just go there. And a picture about lack of nutrition. Cultural food may be less available as it was in Labrador due to climate change there. She's no longer able to provide the traditional foods that he needed, and so he refuses to eat it and is losing weight. This is a study that was done with support of Health Canada, and perhaps going back to more processed, highly processed, unhealthy foods because of that. And a picture from Russia about the substance abuse that we know so often accompanies men's and women's, but particularly men's responses to disaster. It takes a huge toll, short-term, long-term, in all the ways that you can imagine. So shelter, let me move a little faster because I think I'm lingering too much, but shelter is obviously a critical issue, and this person is tasked not only with trying to figure out how to begin to create a safe space for his young son, but also knows that the young son is watching him all of the time. How is dad going to be getting shelter again? I think one of the challenges that men face more than women, and of course it depends on which culture and where exactly you're looking, but for the moment let's assume that men are the primary rebuilders of the homes physically, right? To negotiate with external aid agents who come in with the best of intentions and want to build houses their way, right? So when we say the community resists, the community fights back, well, yes, but when it comes to people who are actually in those negotiations with aid agencies or with the banks or with the loans, very often it's men, because they have that sense of being providers, and that also includes a shelter, a safe space for families. So if they want to build back in a way that respects cultural traditions, they sometimes have to do battle to get it. They often, this is a picture from my country, often just don't have the beginning of the resources. So take on the responsibility, absolutely want to be there, and understand that they need to have a place for their family, don't have any money in order to do it, may have relatively shallow friendship networks. I say this tentatively, because again, we don't know about men's networks of support in disasters. We don't know much about that, right? But what we do know in general is that men and women have different kinds of social networks, and that women's tend to be more dense, more complex, more connections on the spider web, if you will. So when you have widows, and again, we have widowers, we've learned a little bit more about what happens to women in disasters when they are widowed, but not an awful lot at all, really, about what happens to men who lose their life partners in disasters there without necessarily that support system. Or men who move into sheltering and caregiving roles in extremely challenging situations, whether they're here in a shelter or whether they're displaced and separated from their families altogether, right? So physically in a different place, but having to somehow try and make sure that their families are taken care of. And grandfathers who are also, again, challenged to step up and provide for little ones, provide a shelter, try and find safe space, try and find an alternate support system, a caregiving system that they may or may not have ever wanted to or been able to or been tasked to or been able to step in, and now suddenly, due to circumstances, forced to step in there. So work, of course, and another word for work is livelihood. I use work here to, of course, include paid and unpaid work, but the first challenge for so many men, as you know very well, is get that paycheck, get back to work. Everything that you need to move life forward comes down to money, comes down to resources. Got to get back to work. Really, we see that in every disaster, and that's one of the reasons why women's return, their women's economic recovery is slowed. We don't get back to the labor force for the reasons that you know, childcare and other demands like But it's enormous difficulty for him as well. Its work is not always available. This little picture reminds me about what happens so often when external labor comes. We'll be hearing a little bit more this afternoon, I think, about that. External laborers come in and take those jobs away that locals might have been able to do. When you're looking at construction work, which is one of the major sources of income to people, and mainly, again, accrues to men after disastrous construction work, those monies don't always go to local men. It creates enormous animosities and also a lot less money on the home front where it's acutely needed. Exploitation is, of male labor is really a huge, and I think we need to do a lot more work here as well. It's a picture from Katrina, and we had a large influx of workers coming from the south, coming from Central America and coming from Mexico to fill some of the jobs that needed to be done when there was so little shelter available, so a population evacuated. So these were people living in very difficult circumstances in tents along lakes, right? And wage theft was real. Working, never getting paid, right? So the exploitation of migrant workers, documented or undocumented, is an important thing. Men's bodies, we're talking still about work here, are exposed in ways that women's aren't because we don't value men's reproductive health. It's always been a mystery to me when you think about making babies, but we do not value men's reproductive health in the same way that we value women's, right? So this is a picture of, obviously, from Japan after the tsunami and the nuclear meltdown there. Interestingly, there will be a conference in July, and one of the people presenting at our Gender and Disaster session is a young man who's done research on just this, trying to understand how it is that men's lives are being devalued and employers are specifically recruiting men into these very hazardous cleanup jobs around radiation exposure, right? As if, again, the reproductive health of men matters less than women's. Men whose livelihoods depend on the land, and in an era where drought is becoming increasingly normal, and if not drought, then a massive flood next year. In any event, that land, that essential thing that grounds him traditionally for generations, is at risk in so many different kinds of disasters. This little picture comes from Canada, where we did a study of BSE, of mad cow disease, and I met with farmers there whose main concern was that they would lose the family farm, the century farm, the farmers that their forefathers, right, built up from scratch. They would lose them on their shift because, really, of circumstances beyond their control. They were at extreme risk of losing those long-held families. And another thing that comes up when you look at men and challenges to men is around work and the forced economic migration of men and boys. So I mentioned trafficking earlier. There's a fine line between being forced as a child and being forced through economic coercion, really, and being displaced through environmental forces from your own community. But very often the people that you see dying after a disaster are men who have been forced to go into, due to drought, for example, in South Africa, go forced into the gold mining industry. Very, very hazardous. HIV, AIDS high rates, suicides high, malnutrition, everything that's difficult and hard about life gets worse when you're on your own and you're in a migrant hostel, far, far, far from your home. So family issues, again, we are beginning to get a better sense of what single mothers need in disasters, but this young man is a single father, especially a low-income single father. Nope, we don't know much of all of what he needs or what he brings to a disaster as a parent. This is kind of the norm. We had the family norm. There's the mother, the father, the boy, and the girl. So it's a classic kind of American family in a FEMA center. They all face different challenges, but one of the things that he might face is that conflict between getting back to work, being responsible. Say he's a firefighter, or maybe, and she's a teacher, or maybe he works in a chem lab and they need him back, or maybe he's an electrician and they desperately need him back to help get those wires up. At the same time, that his kids don't have a place to sleep at night, and that he has to support her because she's taking care of grandmother, whatever it might be. That conflict between work and family, which is rife in our field, really is acute for men, and is something we need to study a lot more. And poverty, and particularly at the lower levels of poverty, at the fringes of our societies, whatever society you might think of, right? It's an enormous challenge to keep families together. And families are often separated, men are separated, so they don't lack that kind of emotional support system and nutritional support system and everything else that often comes from family life, are divorced from that, and it's an extremely hazardous kind of situation. He's here. This picture for me again stands into what happens to relationships. They're so problematic, I would say, at the best of times, living with each other. I mean, really. And in disasters, everything that's good about us comes together, and stronger relationships tend to get stronger, and the inverse. everything that was really hard and was dividing you before, and some new things as well. And that's where sometimes violence comes up as a new thing in the relationship. Very often it comes up because it was there before. It's always there. But putting aside violence for a moment, there may be a challenge to men to just be there for her in a way that he wasn't before, right? Women looking to him, looking to grandfathers, looking to fathers, looking to grown sons for something, some way to help through, like speak to me, talk with me, be there for me, come to the shelter with me, we need help, what can we be doing? That dialogue, that conversation may be asking something quite new of him. I think that's, again, a challenge. And being self-sufficient. So he might be one of the families from Katrina who was evacuated very far away. His family is maybe in Texas still, and he's trying to put together a life again and picking through clothes to clothe himself when before she might have been doing this. Child-headed households is one of the things that we see in international disasters quite often when the parents are swept to their deaths, as in the case of the tsunami. And so sometimes children, younger or older children will step into the lurch, really, and especially in the tsunami with such high levels of fatalities among girls and women, they were young boys who suddenly stepped into this role of running families. It's very, very difficult, and it happens in the United States as well. Again, some responsibility, so the relationships in a family between brothers, between siblings, is also going to change. And again, that's another kind of challenge that we know way too little about. But sometimes we do know what's going to happen, and in some cultures, again, at some periods of time in our life here on the planet, what's the most important for men after disaster, after losing their partner, is quick, fast, find another wife. And it's easy to kind of make fun of it, but it's a life-saving act and demand for men in a way. You can imagine the results it has when he turns to young child brides, which is what happened after the tsunami, a phenomenon called tsunami brides. So older men, quick, fast, looking for whomever they could quick marry and had the most cultural power to claim as young brides, tend to be young girls whose lives are forever transformed by that. But there's, and again, it's easy to dismiss that, but we have to understand within what context he's doing that. Control, I'm moving toward the end of this section of the talk. Control is obviously a huge issue, this notion of being in control over nature. What more essential bedrock issue about masculinity is there? And what more abject demonstration of man's incapacity to control nature than a hurricane, a tornado, a massive fire? Cannot be avoided at all. Inability to control emotions. And I love this photo because the photographer wrote underneath here, he said, "He cried and I was forced to turn the camera away." So why? Why is that? Why is it that we're able and willing and so self-promotional about women's tears, who are allowed to stand in, our sorrow is allowed to stand in for human grief and disasters, right? But he turns the camera away when the man loses control here. Being demeaned and humiliated, and I have no idea if that's true in this case of the American Red Cross, but it's that sense of lack of control, of having to ask outsiders for help, and men having to ask women for help, an institutional, a bureaucracy, a government. For some people that's extremely difficult. Losing control in the sense of more aggression. That's one of the things that we do find often in disasters. In addition to family violence, there's also male-on-male violence that tends to increase. So just more fighting, more fussing, more hitting, more yelling, and more getting in trouble, more encounters than between men and generally male-dominated police officers, and women pushing back. Women in your face, not standing up. Again, maybe raising issues that have been there forever, or maybe raising issues that are new, or maybe telling him, as we found out in Miami, that when we got a little bit of money after the hurricane and a woman had enough money to get a bus ticket to get out of town and leave a violent relationship, she was gone in a flash, right? So pushback, there's an opportunity for things to really radically change. And that sense of control then is challenged in disasters, and we've talked quite a bit about how that can be, it is basically the bottom premise for increased violence. Closely related is authority, which is a legitimate power, right? So there's control and power, and then there's authority, which is legitimated by faith or by law or by policy, by tradition. So she may or may not accept the authority of the National Guard when they came. Again, this is a picture from Katrina. And he may or may not have accepted the militarization of that city. So many men in uniforms with guns, as you may have seen, this is some time ago now, I know, but came into the city, and there was extraordinary high level of violence, of state-perpetrated violence, the government men killing other men. So she may or may not respect that. And these men clearly did not. So in a humanitarian peacekeeping situation, it's men again who are put into this position of having their authority challenged, which again can be challenging to their well-being, or they're simply mocked. Do you remember the story about Michael Brown, who was the first appointee to manage the Katrina debacle? Right? And his profession before that, his qualifications were that he raised Arabian horses, right? And he was a political appointee. He was not a professional emergency manager, and he was mocked, so his authority was undermined in that way. As was this person from TEPCO, the industry that owns and operates the nuclear power plants in Japan that were so severely damaged, and resigned in shame when he was found to have not done his job, basically, so publicly shamed in that sense. And finally, all of this really wraps into what we can think about as men's identity, which is, of course, very complex, but it's surely not being incompetent, right? So there's a really challenge to your sense of being in control, but also like getting through it, knowing what you're doing, having a plan, having a sense of what to do. Of being self-sufficient, so it robs men and women alike, but perhaps more important to men, I don't know, but perhaps more important to men to be self-sufficient in a way that they can't be, to be the kind of father that you want to be. Really, it's hard enough, again, I would say at the best of times for us to parent in the way that we would want to and that we cherish. And in disasters, it's extraordinarily difficult, especially for men. Or to be a life partner with somebody who's shared your life, and suddenly you're not able to acknowledge that love that you have and that life that you've built together, because you can't jeopardize that in a relief system that doesn't account for people of different sexualities, or that wants only the male head of household, right, or that insists on not protecting your privacy. And there's that notion, that sense of identity, again, of being the first and the helper, the notion very deeply rooted in our cultures of chivalry, right, and challenge as well, because you may not be able to help the person you love most in the world. And that's very hurtful. You may not be able to make sense of the world. The men have a sense of being on top of the world, of being somehow or other the interpreter of the cultural world to children, and often sometimes to women. But disasters transform that radically. So if you're no longer able to tell the story, to tell the cogent story of what's going on, where do you go? Who has what resources? What are we going to do next, dear? That's an extreme challenge, and often leads to depression, which is one of the most widely accounted differences between women and men, more likely to be acknowledged by women than men, but more likely to lead to self-harm among men. So we have really got to take that on board and look. And challenge perhaps to the sense of identity, just fundamentally the identity of being of place, that men have a sense, as do women, both of us, all of us, of a place in a community. And I love that picture. It comes from Canada again. So what's a challenge to them is not just the farm, not just a livelihood, not just that his neighbor may have committed suicide, but having a sense that there's a future for him as a man and a grandfather and a son in a traditional community that he values. So how am I doing on time? Because I need to...
Not well.
Not well? Okay, how not well?
But it's wonderful. So keep on, but we need some question time.
Okay, well, let me move a little quickly toward this, some implications for change. Again, I want to thank you for bringing me, but let's be clear, the woman who should have been here, unfortunately, was caught up in a really terrible bike accident. And I say should have because this is Shelley Patchlock, a young sociologist at the University of British Columbia, who's just completed a really great study that compares different groups of men fighting fires in this big Okanagan fire, basically. And perhaps it's a theme here that some of you as researchers or policymakers would want to explore a little bit more. She's not able to be here, so I thought I'd throw in a few slides anyway that express some of her work for you. And I just love this first sentence, which I will read aloud. In the case of the Mountain Park fire, firefighters worked to protect patriarchy, natural resources, and homes, but were most successful in protecting patriarchy. Write that down, because you will hear that sentence over and over and over again. Well, what does that mean? Just to give you a sense of what her argument was. It was a massive fire. It was quick. It was fast. It was fought both by wildland, firefighters, the crew, the wildland, what do you call them here? I'm not quite sure what you would call them here. But structural firefighters do houses, and say again? And the bushfire crews would be us. So we have the different firefighters coming from radically different traditions, and all put upon to explain why they lost, why they failed. They took this on so hard when they lost so many houses. Not too many people lost their lives, so quite different, of course, from your experience, right? But still, a sense of great loss. So it was incumbent upon them, she found in her conversations with, I think, 120 men, to explain why. And one of the things that they fell back on was that it was his fault. And the structural wildfires, structural house fires were basically impugning the masculinity of the crews, the wildland, the bushfire crews, right? Conversely, the bushfire crews were really highly critical of the structural firefighters, the house firefighters. And there was a lot of back and forth thing, a lot of really obnoxious jokes, which I won't share with you, but there was really just a sense of hostility that grew over time and became divisive in the field. So that was one of the ways that they tended to cope with that. So instead of coming together around that, they again created these tensions and conflicts because they felt, because of that close link between successful firefighters and successful masculinity, they felt unmasked and unmanned in a way. And there were a lot of other factors going on. The media, for example, played it up hugely. And it was a whole lot easier to go do an interview with the firefighters, the structural firefighters, because they lived in town, than it was to go talk with the firefighters who were actually out in the bush fighting the fire. So there was that kind of, that kind of imbalance in terms of the visibility of the labor there. But there were material resources too. In the end of the day, the people who got pay raises were the structural firefighters and not the people who lost their lives out. They didn't lose their lives, but they gave a more physical response, shall we say, in the bush. So a lot of lingering hostility there, and she's trying to tease apart what that means. And one of the things she looked at then was, well, how does that affect, or does it, how does that relate to fire crews that have been integrated? And you have women coming onto the crews, because as here, I'm sure you have women on your fire crews as well, in small numbers, I think, and that was true in Canada, it's true in the United States as well. And interestingly, she was looking at that. She found that there was some bonding of these two groups of men who, again, are just arguing each other and bad-mouthing it to the press and putting each other down, and he's a weenie and she's a whatever. But when women came on the scene, they all found themselves in support of that and were able to articulate a sense of themselves as being modern men, egalitarian men, pro-feminist men, in support of the women, and a different kind of a firefighter, not depending so much on brawn or even on big heavy machines as on being smart, being strategic, being prepared, being flexible, those kinds of things. So in that sense, she leaves us with a sense that there may be a new future there, that the entry of women into traditionally male jobs such as firefighting can help spark. Although in balance, her book is quite depressing because of this conflict that she sees between these two groups of men, which is, again, undermined their solidarity, and they took it on, and it was hurtful to men who felt personally responsible for losing. Well, more positively, and I'll just run through these slides very quickly, I think that there are real signs of change, both in academia, in terms of masculinity studies and sex and sexuality. Definitely when we look at development work, there's a lot more attention to men and masculinities in development, so we need to build on that. I won't talk much about those. That disasters do create opportunities for fundamental structural transformational change, including in gender relations, if we will grab them, if we understand them, if we want to make those kinds of changes, they're potentially possible. So let me end with just a few examples of good practice, or I would say promising practice, just to give us a sense of what's happening on the ground here. This is a lovely little flyer that comes from Florida, and I appreciate it because it features a man here, and it's about being prepared before the next hurricane in Florida for increases in domestic violence. What a novel idea. We know this, we have 20 years of research. Let's be prepared for it. Let's make sure there's funding there, that the staff is supported, that there's a public education campaign around that. So that's a good thing, and it's led by men. This notion that men are more, I think, engaged in that physical, that reaching out, that one-on-one support between men. I think we see many indicators of that. This is just one from a fire in Texas. A new colleague of mine is, I guess his name is not here, Joe Smanlin, runs the Disaster Distress Helpline, and because he brought with him to this work, it's a new mental health helpline in the States, he had a long tradition of working in the anti-violence movement himself, so he was interested in domestic violence and disaster. He organized this Twitter chat. Was that what they're called? Twitter? So I'm so not into Twitter. But it was an innovative kind of idea, and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence worked with this mental health line around using the new technologies to talk about domestic violence. This is a campaign that comes from Nicaragua, where in the process of recovering from Hurricane Mitch, the organizers of this NGO built into their recovery modules work around violence and how men, this says, disaster against women is one disaster. Violence against women is one disaster that men can prevent. So again, a very progressive kind of notion. In the States, I'm quite intrigued by this. These are a military, these are our vets, the Team Rubicon, who have really stepped forward to try and use the skills and aptitudes and experiences that they bring with them from battle of some one kind or another into disaster work. Not through the National Guard, not through military institutions, but as volunteers, right? So this is, I think, a positive step forward for many reasons. A lot of faith-based men's groups. If you look at gender-specific responses that are not government, but that are communities-based, a lot of them tend to be based in faith. You're looking at auxiliaries of groups. So I think that's something that we need to know a little bit more about, and it's definitely the Baptists have led the way. These are young gay children or youth in the Philippines who are taking part in an explicitly inclusive sexuality-sensitive kind of disaster training program. We should do the same. These men are learning about disaster and gender in a program from India and exploring the contents of women's pocketbooks in this picture. I only wish that we did the same more often. I think it would bring us together in unanticipated ways. And how can I not have a picture of men's sheds? I don't know the context for this photo. Maybe some of you can help me know about it. But I'm so enamored of the notion of men's sheds. And I know that they don't that they work for some more than others and perhaps are too freighted in some way, but I love it. I love the idea, and so I put that forward as a best practice, which I talk up wherever I go. This is a final slide, really, of showing an example of communities. These are indigenous communities from northern Alaska after the Exxon Valdez spill who came down to help the indigenous communities that were affected by the BP spill and by the hurricanes there, coming together to try and share indigenous knowledge and to support one another. And they did it by recreating drums, and had a drum making ceremony so that the children would learn again what that was like. And it brought women together again, women and men together. It was strongly led by women, funded by women's organizations, but they wouldn't have dreamed of having it without men. And the men wouldn't have dreamed of coming if they're alone, basically. So it's a good model, I think, for us that when we put our hearts to it, we can do excellent work. When we work together, we do better work. And here we are together. I end this with the firm belief that we are starting something absolutely new and critically important to building a safer, more resilient, more just, more livable, more men-friendly, more women-friendly kind of a world. And if we don't, shame on us, because we have the opportunity to do so. We have the resource to do so. So again, thank you for your attention. And I want to just repeat again, I'm here to listen and to learn as much as anything else, but I hope that this has helped kind of put the work that you do today in a little bit of a context. So with that, I'll stop.